Hello everyone, Richard here at Calvin Wazoo, where you got nothing when you've got nothing left to lose. And I'm going to talk about two books today, two banned books, or at least they were banned at the time of their publication. And they're both about illicit sex, but they're about different kinds of sex. One is D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover, and the other is Gore Vidal's The City and the Pillar, which I read from this anthology. So one is about heterosexual sex, the other one is about homosexual sex. And both books at the time were maybe vanguards, but their content made publishers and others very uncomfortable with their frankness in discussing the topic of sex. But I think, particularly with Lady Chatterley's Lover, I think there was more to it than just the sex that got this book in trouble with the authorities. I'm going to start off here first with Lady Chatterley's Lover, D.H. Lawrence. It was published in 1928. So yeah, this was quite the shocker of the time in terms of its very explicit descriptions of sexual activity. Now, by today's standards, I would say that they are not quite that graphic, but they're still pretty graphic descriptions, especially for a book of 1928. And it's, I have to say it's kind of comical the way the acts are described using the lexicon of the day. It's really quite amusing, and it doesn't have as much shock value as it would have had back in 1928. The gist of the story is you've got Lady Chatterley, who is Connie. She becomes a lady because she marries Clifford, who is a member of the landed gentry in England at the time. And they get married, although Connie has already had worldly experience. When she was in her late teens, she went to school in Germany, would have been before World War I, where, she had sex and fell in love with a German boy there. So she was deflowered when she returned. And then she married Clifford, who, had an estate, lots of money. They, if I recall, they had sex maybe once before he was shipped off to World War I. And he becomes injured in the war, and he is wheelchair bound afterward. And he makes it known to Connie that he wouldn't mind if she did have an affair and had a child, so that he could have an heir to their estate, which is called Ragby. She would need to come back to him, that she couldn't fall in love with somebody else and leave him, which initially she sort of poo-poos the idea. But she does begin having an affair with this Irishman who comes to visit, who is sort of a parasite. His name is, I'm going to call him Michael, because the Irish pronunciation, the way it's spelled in the book, I've got no idea how to pronounce it. And it's kind of interesting when they have sex, he finishes quickly, but she's learned this technique to deal with men, that if they can stay with her a little longer after they're finished, she can do these contractions that will allow her to achieve an orgasm. So this is really shocking content for 1928, and certainly was a large part that this book was banned. However, there's another part of this book that I think upset the powers that be even more, and that's the way it discusses class and class separation. Because her next affair is with the gamekeeper on the estate, Mellors. And it's interesting because Mellors, when he speaks and talks with Connie during their liaisons, he switches very comfortably between the vernacular, the Yorkshire vernacular of the working class people, and of the speech patterns of the gentry. Because during the war, he was a officer. So, but he comes from a working class background. So it's like he knows how both worlds operate. And it's the discussion and the presentation of if you've got Clifford in the estate at Rugby, and he owns this coal mining operation. And so there's a lot of discussion in the book about class differences, and the roles of class. And that, I think, is what really irritated the censors even more. There's this one observation here that Connie makes, that about the area of England where they live. So I want to read this. Now they are pulling down the stately homes. The Georgian halls are going. Fritchley, a perfect old Georgian mansion, was even now, as Connie passed in the car, being demolished. It was in perfect repair. Till the war, the Weatherleys had lived in style there. But now it was too big, too expensive, and the country had become too uncongenial. The gentry were departing to pleasanter places where they could spend their money without having to see how it was made. So the estate that Connie lives with Clifford in, Rugby, is in a coal mining vicinity. So the homes of the miners are very close by. The mine and mining operation is very close by. The burning of the coal and the soot, it's throughout the novel. So it helps present the atmosphere as being crepuscular and sooty, and so it really suits the mood of the story. And then so the discussions tend to get a little more more contentious. So there is Connie starts having a discussion with Clifford. Let me double check here. I believe it is Clifford, and not Mellors. Let me double check here. Yeah, it's with Clifford. And they're talking about, he's expressing his idea of why it's necessary to have a ruling class over the working class, and how futile the strikes are by the workers, to try and get better wages and better working conditions. Connie says, "Oh, good," said Connie, "if only there weren't more strikes." And Clifford replies, "What would be the use of their striking again? Merely ruin the industry, what's left of it, and surely the owls are beginning to see it." "Perhaps they don't mind ruining the industry," said Connie. "Ah, don't talk like a woman. The industry fills their bellies, even if it can't keep their pockets quite so flush," he said, using turns of speech that oddly had a twang of Mrs. Bolton, the housekeeper. "But didn't you say the other day that you were a conservative anarchist?" she asked innocently. "And did you understand what I meant?" he retorted. "All I mean is people can be what they like and feel what they like and do what they like, strictly privately, so long as they keep the form of life intact and the apparatus." Connie walked on in silence a few paces. Then she said, obstinately, "Sounds like saying an egg may go as addled as it likes, so long as it keeps its shell on whole, but addled eggs do break of themselves." "I don't think people are eggs," he said. "Not even angels' eggs, my dear little evangelist." He was in rather high feather this bright morning. The larks were trilling away over the park. The distant pit in the hollow was fuming silent steam. It was almost like old days before the war. Connie didn't really want to argue, but then she did not really want to go to the wood with Clifford either. So she walked beside his chair in a certain obstinacy of spirit. "No," he said, "there will be no more strikes if the thing is properly managed." "Why not?" "Because strikes will be made as good as impossible." "But will the men let you?" she asked. "We shan't ask them. We shall do it while they aren't looking, for their own good, to save the industry." "For your own good, too," she said. "Naturally, for the good of everybody, but for their good even more than mine. I can live without the pits. They can't. They'll starve if there are no pits. I've got other provision." So, yeah, the class distinction and this hubris of the landed gentry into thinking that it's just their duty to take care of the poor, because without them, the poor would starve. Really quite telling. And as I say, I think that probably had a lot more to do with the objections from, the censors. And then there's this discussion, or I should say a sort of soliloquy by Mellors, the gamekeeper, with whom Connie is having this very, very torrid affair. And he's talking about how modern man at that time was becoming emasculated by society. Let's see here. All the lot. This is Mellors talking. All the lot. Their spunk is gone. Oh, and by the way, I'm going to read what's written here, and there are some vulgar words being used, so I apologize ahead of time, but I'm not going to censor what I'm reading here. I'm going to read what D.H. Lawrence wrote. All the lot. Their spunk is gone dead. Motor cars and cinemas and aeroplanes sucked the last bit out of them. I tell you, every generation breeds a more rabbity generation, with India rubber tubing for guts and tin legs and tin faces. 10 people. It's all a steady sort of Bolshevism, just killing off the human thing and worshiping the mechanical thing. Money, money, money. All the modern lot get their real kick out of killing the old human feeling out of man, making mincemeat of the old Adam and the old Eve. They're all alike. The world is all alike. Kill off the human reality. A quid for every foreskin, 2 quid for each pair of balls. What is cunt but machine fucking? It's all alike. Pay 'em money to cut off the world's cock. pay money to them that will take spunk out of mankind and leave them all little twiddling machines. So he's got this real bitterness toward the state of affairs, which Connie comes to agree with, but it also excites her in many ways. So I think it's passages like that really, that's why the censors took umbrage with this book. Certainly they had the excuse of the sex and the way the sex is being described in the book. But I really do think it's the comments being made about the class separation, and that, especially for the time, 1928, that's what really irked the censors. Well, then I decided after reading that, I was going to finally read The City and the Pillar, which by Gore Vidal, which is part of this anthology that I have of some of his works. There's Julian, then Willowa, which I've read before, but the others I have not read. I have not read Julian. I have not read The Judgment of Paris. I have not read Messiah, and then I just finished reading The City and the Pillar, which was published in 1948, and it was banned. The main character is a gay man, and now it's less explicit about the sex. I mean, it talks about the sex that Jim, the main character, is involved in, but it doesn't describe it graphically. It is more focused on being a homosexual in the era of World War II, or just before World War II. And it might be the first serious gay novel that was published. Now, Christopher Isherwood in 1939 had published Goodbye to Berlin, which has gay and bisexual characters in it, and I think it was kind of used as the plot concept for the play and the film Cabaret. But the gay and bisexual characters are sort of secondary. They're not the central theme of the story. And there are other works that are set in, for example, Edwardian England, such as the E.M. Forster novel Morris. But that wasn't published until 1971. So it could very well be, at least among the first serious gay novels that focused on a gay character and addressed the issue of being gay in the U.S. anyway, at that time. So you've got this straight-acting gay man, Jim. He comes from a middle-class family, some maybe upper middle-class family, and he has an affair, or, he has an experience with his best chum in high school. And it just, was natural. But they go their own separate ways after high school. His buddy ends up joining the Merchant Marine, and Jim tries to do the same thing. He gets in the Merchant Marine, but on a different ship. They don't ship out together because Jim was a year behind. His friend graduated ahead of him. So we follow Jim, and he's on the Merchant Marine. He's becoming aware that he is attracted to men, but it's a difficult growth. He struggles with it. He's athletic. He's straight acting, so he can pass. And he goes through a couple experiences where he could easily have women, but he just can't do it. And that frustrates him. And gradually over time, he ends up in Hollywood, where he ends up hooking up with a actor, very well-known actor, who is gay but keeps appearances, etc. But ends up living with him, and he gradually becomes more accepting of him being attracted to men, but it's all very superficial because he has it in his mind that, he's in love with his high school buddy and he's going to get together with him someday. So the affairs that he have are basically largely just hookups, or he lives with this actor for a while. Then he also lives with a writer for a while, so it's the sex is casual and meaningless. And so you get these observations that Gore Vidal is saying through Jim that come off today as being bitter in many ways, but also very judgmental. And I grew up, all right, even though I grew up in the 70s, which was very, a liberated time for many gay men, I nonetheless grew up in a rural area, so I was very isolated. And so that oppression that was both external and internal affected me a great deal. So I understand sometimes Gore Vidal's perspective. For example, there's this passage in here where he writes, Jim had also begun a social life. Several times he had gone on parties with the bellhops. This is when he was in Hollywood working as a tennis instructor at a hotel. And he immediately sensed that many of the bellhops were gay. But he was trying to play up his straightness. Most of them wanted to be actors, which explained the somewhat detached air with which they did their jobs around the hotel. Several took a fancy to Jim because he didn't want to become an actor. Also, he seemed sincerely to admire them. Jim was not without social guile, yet his new companions puzzled him. Their conversation was often cryptic, their eyes quick-moving, searching. Ill at ease with outsiders, they were quarrelsome with one another. The one thing they had in common was the desire to move in narcissistic splendor through the lives of others, to live forever grandly and not to die. So, yeah, he was describing the whole gay clique scene, which he was reacting sort of dismissive and again, a little bit of hubris and the holier than thou. Then when he was with the writer, Sullivan, this is where he also begins to realize how others are the way people negotiate life, being gay. Sullivan was the first person Jim had ever met who found obscure pleasure in his own pain, observed by failure, professional and private, and unable to relieve himself in scenes like Shaw. That was the actor that Paul had lived with. Jim had lived with. Paul is Paul Sullivan, sorry. Paul's only outlet was to write. Yet even in his work, he was so studied and inhibited that all he could ever convey was a light bitterness, a casual anger at the world which, all in all, had done well by him. A doting family until he ceased to be Catholic at 16, There was much argument then, but he would not budge. Even the family priest gave him up at last, perfectly bewildered by this unlooked-for apostasy. None suspected that he had forsaken the church because he was homosexual. For a long time, he had tried to exorcise the unnatural spirit, demanding furiously of God that he be freed of this terrible inclination. He prayed continually, but in the end, God failed him, and he turned to hell. He studied a book of witchcraft, celebrated a black mass, excuse me, tried to sell his soul to the devil in order to be free of lust. But the devil had no use for him either. So Paul Sullivan abandoned all religion. In some respects, that kind of portrayed my experience, eventually rejecting the church. But I was still trying to find some type of spirituality. And then I reached the same conclusion. It's just all hokum. And eventually recognized that search for some kind of ecclesiastical or ecumenical meaning just really interfered with my personal growth. So there was this other passage here. Why did I tap this one? Oh, yeah, some more observations while Jim was in New York. Winter passed swiftly. Jim saw Shaw occasionally, and Shaw was friendly and amusing and introduced him to a number of people who had money and nothing to do. There were many different homosexual worlds in New York, and each usually had some knowledge of the others. There was also the half-world where hetero and homosexual mingled with a certain degree of frankness. This was particularly true of theatrical and literary groups. But in the highest society, the homosexual wore a stylized mask in order to move gracefully and often unconvincingly among admiring women who were attracted to him because his understanding was as great as his demands were few. Occasionally, two homosexuals might meet in the great world. When they did, by a quick glance, they acknowledged one another and, like amused conspirators, observed the effect each was having. It was a form of Freemasonry. So, yeah, in those days, you needed to know the code. You needed to have gaydar, in order to find other people, which nowadays is probably just not quite as essential. So it was the book, The City and the Pillar, is more an observation, a cynical observation of the homosexual life, at that time in the late 30s and into the 1940s, and then subsequently into the early 1950s. And also the fact that people, especially, gay men, they got married because they believed at that time, and given the circumstances, it was easier to assimilate than it was to announce, to come out. Especially if you were, as in the character Jim, a straight-acting gay who could pass. And a lot of gay men did do that. Sometimes the marriages were mutually beneficial. The wife was a lesbian, or the wife was uninterested in sex anyway, and they genuinely liked each other, the man and the woman. But then others were marriages brought about by pressure, the gay man feeling that this was, the societal pressure. I should be married. I should be raising a family. And then they carry this guilt with them because they genuinely loved their wives. but they were sneaking out and sleeping with men. And when, that led to a whole genre of coming out films, in particular later, like in the 1970s and the 1980s, particularly with films like Lost Language of Cranes, where the women feel betrayed because they really loved their husbands. And their husbands really loved them, but it was difficult for the women to grasp this concept that they were not sexually attractive to their spouse. And there was a whole series, especially in cinema, of this very negative and dour description of homosexual life, such as with The Boys in the Band. It wasn't until, well, then you had the AIDS crisis, so you had many films that were very focused, again, on tragedy, and it was a tragedy. The AIDS epidemic was a major tragedy. But, being gay was tragedy. That's how it was portrayed. And it wasn't until post-AIDS that we started to get, both in film and in literature, stories that were more positive in their outlook. Although there were some early ones, Morris to a degree. I have not read the book Morris. I've seen the film. And at least in the film, there is hope in that film, but that's another one steeped in class. Probably I'm wondering if E.M. Forster kind of stole the idea from Gore Vidal's The City and the Pillar, because you have Morris falling in love, I think he perhaps stole the idea from D.H. Lawrence, because Lady Chatterley falls in love with a gamekeeper. Morris falls in love with a gamekeeper. And the issues of class are very, very evident in that storyline as well. So anyway, I've rambled on here for a half hour about these two important books. And they're good books. They're not great books, in my opinion. They're good. I didn't once feel like, oh God, when is this going to be over? It wasn't a chore to read these. And they certainly are representative of their era. But there are much better works being published now, not just about being gay, but also about dealing with class distinctions, etc. And so, but yeah, I think if you're interested in, reading content like this, these are worth reading. But they're not, I don't think they're going to make it in anyone's top 10 list. Anyway, there you have it. My reactions to Gore Vidal's The City and the Pillar and D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover. Leave a comment in the Down Under, your thoughts, reactions to what I've been saying here, or if you've got some other information you think is relevant. Love getting the comments, so appreciate that. Please give a thumbs up, like the video, even if you're already subscribed to my channel. And thank you very much if you have subscribed. I really do appreciate that. I also have an Instagram account where I go under the handle of NewsDude76. That's NEWZDUDE76. And I post a variety of image content related to lots of topics. And then I have a Facebook page called Calvin Wazoo, which is primarily focused on music-related content, both videos that I create talking about records in music, but other videos that I find in articles about musical artists and music in general. So follow me there too. Again, thank you so much for bearing with me, tolerating me, indulging me, And remember to pray for the people inside your head, for they won't be there when you're dead.